Good morning, this is woodblock printmaker Dave Bull, speaking to you not from my usual spot in the now closed Asakusa shop, but from up on the second floor of our building, in the small room where we keep our print collection, although today's video isn't directly related to these collection materials. On our YouTube channel now, there are upwards of 100 or so videos. Some show the process of printmaking. Some introduce older prints from my collection. Others are for telling stories about my earlier days in the printmaking field. But there is one particular video that stands out from all the rest. You've probably seen it. Unless you are a complete and total newbie to this YouTube channel, you have seen it. Everybody who talks to me about our YouTube videos says the same thing. I first came across your videos because YouTube recommended one, and at that point I interject. You mean the one about me meeting the old Carver? And they reply, yes, that one. How did you know? Now, when I made that video, I had no idea at all that it would turn out to be so interesting for people. I had received the woodblock that I showed in that video just a few days before that, thought it might make a somewhat interesting episode, and pretty much just sat down, turned the camera on, and tried to tell the story, figuring that it would take about 10 minutes or so. It took a bit longer than that, but it seems the somewhat disjointed, rambling nature of the story didn't bother people so much. And over the few years since then, I have received wonderful, wonderful feedback from many people who have watched the whole thing. Now, why do I bring this up today? Am I about to bring you another similar video? Please don't get all excited about such a thing. That production was pretty much a one-off, I think. There will be lots more videos to come, but they will have their own shape and style. I can't replicate that experience. Having said that though, today's video does indeed have a very strong connection to remembering a Carver. If it hasn't been too long since you have seen it, you might remember one particular scene. Let's have an instant replay of one little clip from that video. And after it aired, I received an interesting package in the post from the producer. The woman, the lady producer, she knew how much that trip to Ito-san had been useful for me and important for me. And what she did was she sent me a package of 4 video cassettes. And these are the raw footage that were taped at Ito-san's house that day in 1992. They'd used bits of it in the 2 programs, the first program and then the 1-hour documentary later. And she thought, rather than just throw this away on the cutting room floor, hey, send it to Dave. The good, interesting parts are the ones used in the programs, but there's a full hour of footage of Ito-san working at his bench, for the most part uninterrupted, with me sitting there watching, trying to glean as much as I could, remember as much as I could. And now I've got them here. I can watch them again and again and again. And here they still are. The old cassettes containing the raw footage from the visit that I made to Ito-san in 1992 in the company of a TV production crew. 1992. That's 28 years ago. Same plastic bag too, I guess. Seems plastic really does live forever. Now it's time, of course, a long past time, to have a look at some of this together. Over the years, I've received any number of emails and comments about these tapes. Dave, please get them digitized. They will decay and that information will be lost forever. Well, I'm here to let you know that last week I finally got around to doing that digitizing job. And they came out quite clean and clear. Now, we're not talking 4K levels of HD clarity here, of course, but it will still serve as an interesting window into Ito-san's work. Now, there's no point in just dumping the whole thing onto YouTube. This really is raw footage. There are lots of places where the cameraman is struggling to get things in focus, or where Ito-san, he kept getting his head in the way of the carving, or where there's simply nothing happening. So I've gone through them all from start to finish. I've identified a number of episodes where Ito-san was explaining something to me, or where there was a good question-answer interchange, or where we are simply able to sit and watch him quietly carve. And I'll present some of those to you now, using a combination of a voiceover commentary on what's going on, or by putting subtitles in some places, so you can follow the actual conversation, such as it was. Our visit that day was conducted, of course, entirely in Japanese, and I have to say, pretty cringe-worthy Japanese on my part. I know my story, and I'm sticking to this, is that this was pretty early days for me in Japan, and I just couldn't handle everything people were throwing at me. Anyway, enough talk. Let's dig in. It's a rainy day in the spring of 1992, and after more than 10 years of playing around with this craft of Japanese printmaking, Dave is getting his first ever chance to meet a real carver. Let's tag along. The man walking with me here is Keizaburo Matsuzaki. If you've seen the original Remembering a Carver video, you will have heard me talking about him. He is one of the two men who were taking part in that cultural experience I attended one day, where a lecturer talked about ukiyo-e and two craftsmen gave demonstrations. Matsuzaki-san had been very open with me, inviting me to his workshop, giving me tons of advice, introduction to suppliers. He even gave me some of his brushes. It wasn't possible to have such interaction with a carver until this TV program came along to set it up. And here I was, finally entering a carver's workshop and face to face with Ito-san, introducing myself in my broken Japanese. The producer had spent lots of time with me before this visit. She knew the kind of questions I would have, and she'd primed Ito-san with some, talking points. So once we were ready, he knew what was expected of him, and he jumped in right off the bat without any prompting from either me or her, beginning to talk about, you can guess, the feathering effect on ukiyo-e hairlines.
こう横から見るとね、こう下がってるでしょ、こういうふうにこう鴨のように下がってるでしょ。わかります。わかります。こう、これをね、こう下げて掘らなきゃいけないんです。これ。板ぼかし。そうそうそう、早い話。それね、板ぼかしはさ、特差でこうやるけど、これはね、塔でずっと塔でこう下げていくんですよ、こういうふうに。そうすると結局同じようにこうなんていうんですかね、細く先が細くこういくんですよ、こうね、先がね。
透明になりますね。
それをね、ブツッと掘っちゃうとここで止まっちゃうんですよ、こうね。だからこれをね、私よく実演の時にね、皆さんにあれするけど、こうとにかくこういうふうに下げてね、ちょうどかまぼこみたいにこういうふうにこうね、掘らなくちゃいけないんですよね。それはこれでそういうふうにね、こうやっていくんです。
Now this was all very well, but didn't tell me anything that I didn't really already know. He just waved the knife in the air vaguely. But how did a carver actually do this on the block? So I pushed forward a little bit.
細かいところと大きな線同じ角度で折りますか？
いや、違います。これはね、ここは特別にね、研ぎますよ。例えばね、要するに薄っぱっていってね、これこう立ててやるとこれ厚っぱになるから、なるべくこうね、こうやって研ぎますよ。とこれがさ、薄くなるわけですよ。これで研いてね、これあれですよ。ちょっと真似事をしますけどね、まずね、これをね、これなくなってんですよ。これでこうね、これ砥石の面を平らにする、こうね、平らにこう、そうしといてね、まあこれはちょっとかけて、これをね、今言ったあたりで厚くするにはこうなるわけですよね。薄くやるにはこうやるんです。こうね、こうね、こう。
Okay, let's pause this here because there's an important point that is perhaps going to be missed. The cameraman was really struggling, as you can see. I mean, he had no idea what Ito-san was going to do or which way he would face or what the important points we were trying to look at were. But here, looking over the cameraman's shoulder, we can catch a couple of shots that might show this point. It's all about how to get the knife sharpened to the super thin shape required for the hair carving. Here in this first shot, he is holding the blade with the tip edge on the stone, but the rest of the blade held up a bit higher. The tip itself will be cut back, resulting in a fatter blade. stronger but not suitable for the hair carving. Now, the second shot, here look, you can see the faint shadow under the leading edge. This shows that he has lowered his hands, and it is the area behind the tip that will be mainly ground down, leaving the blade much thinner. The cameraman knew he wasn't doing a good job there, so he scrambled around to the other side. And now we get to see how Ito-san holds his upper body while sharpening.
だけどね、これをね、これをこうやってつけなきゃいけないんです。これを。で、これがつかないでこうやるでしょ。こうやると、これが平らにいかない。Do
you see what is happening here? His body is planted on the tatami mats. His right elbow is supported on his knee, and his shoulders are swinging back and forth. But his head is barely moving. How does he do that?
これ上げちゃってやるとこれは丸パンになっちゃう。ね。でまあこれ解いたらね、そしたら今度はね、この合わせ戸って言ってね、今度はこれで仕上げるんです。これで。まあおたくもこれでやってるでしょうけどね。これで今度はね、まあこっち帰りますよね、こう少し。解いてるとこっち帰ってくるでしょ、こうね。だから今度はその帰ったやつを取るわけです、これで。これもやっぱり平らにするためにね。
We can't see the action here again, but it's straightforward. Ito-san is rubbing the back of the blade over the stone to remove the faint burr at the edge. In the West, this step is usually done with a strop. In Japan, on a very fine and hard stone, lubricated with water. At one point in our conversation, Ito-san tried to explain the concept of omote and ura, front and back, as it applies to brush strokes. But I couldn't catch the meaning of what he was trying to say. How can a brush stroke have a front and a back? So he grabbed a sheet of paper to draw it out for me. It turned out to be quite an important point.
こう文字を彫る場合ね、のって字ね、の、それからこういうひらがなでしっていうね、これね、そっちから見るとね、これはね、こっちは筆裏なんですよ、筆裏、筆裏。こっちはね、筆の表の中、これはきれいに彫るんです、こっちは。ね。筆裏の方は、これもさ、意識してこうギザギザにやっちゃいけないんですよ。だから、塔でいくらかこっちをこう動かすと。いくらか、筆裏の方は。ね。例えば、こうもそうですよ。こっちは筆の表だから、これはきれいにこうね、きれいに。こっちは筆裏だから。ね。筆裏はいくらかそのね、そうだからって意識してこういうふうに彫っちゃダメですよ、これはね。これしの字なんてのはこれ特に難しいんで、これもこうね、こうなって、こっちは筆の表だからこれきれいにいいんです、こっちは。で
下は反対。
だから筆の裏側はこれはね、いくらかこのね、だからそれはね、口では言えないけど、そういうふうに彫るってことはもうね、私はもうその年季中からそういうことをよく言われてる。で
細かい丸、文字の中にある細かい丸時、いつも
書けるでしょ。それは私たちでも書けるんだから。63年間前に彫ったってやっぱり書けるんだよね。だからこれをね、いきなりガーッてやったらダメですよ。だからもうね、それ書けない程度にこう少しずつね、こういうふうにこうやってね、これは筆の表今彫って、今度はこっちが裏側だから、裏側の場合はいくらかこうね、こんな小さいもんでも多少はこうね、ほとんどまっすぐでいいんだけど気持ちでいくらかこうね、動かしてね、こういうふうにね、こうね。 あ、これね、これ。あ、そうか。左だから左っぱになるわけね。
糸さんのより長いです。
これはね、あなた手が長いから、これが長いから、ね。私はこれ短いから。
ハンドルだけじゃなくて、
いや、これね、従ってね、これはね、この首の方はね、この先はね、個人個人の差があって、長くする人もいれば短い人もいる。
そうですね。自分の手
に合わせて。だけど、これは、あなたはこれでちょうど使いいいんだからね、これは、口金はなくなっちゃった。
いや、めんどくさい。
でもこれね、なんかこれで押さえた方がいいですよ。これで多少動くから。これは本当にね、うち帰ったら早速ね、こういうのを買ってね。これあるんですよ。うちない、あったら入れた方がいいです。ここはね。でなければ、三味線糸でこうね。
三味線糸。
つまりこれは私みんな三味線糸なんですよ。これは三味線糸、これ。
あ、そうですか。
ね。
私ただの
いや、これはダメだ、これ。三味線糸、三味線糸はね、輪っかになって売ってるからいくらでね。
Now at this point, Ito-san launched into a demonstration of how to wrap the blade tightly into the handle using the shamisen string. It was a disaster. Of course, Ito-san did fine, of course. I mean, from the filming point of view. There's nothing in the tapes that I can show you. The cameraman, he tried his best, but it was all just like Ito-san going round and round like this. It was impossible for us to see what was going on. But the tying job actually is a straightforward process, and I have a series of photos on my website that show it clearly. I'll put a link to that in the video description.
これは私の作品です。
はいはい。よくできてますよ。よくできてます。
ありがとうございます。
これはよくできてます。
彫りですか？すりですか？
彫りもすりもよくできてます。なかなかこの目なんかね、目なんかよくできてます。
一番難しいところ。
ね、難しいところ、よくできてます。
息止まって。
そう。いや息ついちゃいけない。こんなもう一息ね。この字もよく彫れてます。字も。
わかりますよ。これは一番最初。これは一番新しい。
あとね、そう。わかるこれ。
もちろんですね。文字のところ。
これはね。だってね、これ。
いや、ギュッギュッ。
そうね。こっちの柔らかみあるね。これ例えばこのね、この毛彫ってもこれはぶつ切りになっちゃってるね。こっちはどっかしんなりしてるね。
3年違うです。
ね。これが一番先、これが一番後。これだけ上達しちゃったんですよ。
The next section of these tapes is also not so useful for us. The producer had some definite ideas about some particular shots she wanted in the finished documentary. So she and the cameraman worked on getting those shots while he and I just talked about this and that. She wanted shots of a tool being passed from the hand of the master to the apprentice. Ito-san explaining something or other. Dave listening to something or other. And she wanted overall shots of the two of us together. Now, once she had got those in the can, she was pretty much ready to wrap it all up and say our goodbyes. But I was actually a tad frustrated at this point. Of course, I had learned a lot of individual points. I'd seen a bit of sharpening. I'd gathered a bunch of hints as to how to improve my work, but I hadn't had any chance to see the guy actually work. Now, this was all a long time ago, and I can't remember the actual conversation between she and I, but I did manage to express this. And so she went along. She asked Ito-san, please sit and do some carving on your TV block, the one that he kept on his desk for demonstrations. And he did. The camera rolled, But I didn't care about that. I just sat there for the next 5 minutes or so with my mouth tightly shut, no stupid questions, and just simply watched. Here's what I saw.
ここでね、今度はこっちを掘るときにね、こうやってこっちから来たのこっちから来たのが十文字になるとね。
So there we have it. I tell you, seeing this again was a real time travel episode for me. It was like, look at that little kid. Hard to believe this was over a quarter of a century ago. What have I done with my life, the original video I made about him, the Remembering a Carver video, has over the years received many comments, thousands of them. They are overwhelmingly positive, sometimes embarrassingly so. But among them are quite a few referring to Ito-san as my sensei. Now this is not how it works in Japan. He himself would never, not in 1,000 years, have thought of himself as anybody's sensei. He was a shokunin, a craftsman. This is a laborer. His job was to cut wood. The publishers send him blocks. He carves them. Remember also, during most of his productive years, this craft wasn't so healthy. Traditional woodblock printmaking declined steadily all through the post-war period, except for a small bump during the first Tokyo Olympics back in the 60s. So there was really never any opportunity for him to even think about taking on an apprentice or passing on his techniques. There simply wasn't any prospect of a stable future for such a young person. Now, that was the world he was living in when I came along. Just another foreigner who was kind of curious about this and who was giving it a try. He had seen them before. They came, asked a ton of noisy questions, did a bit of something, and then disappeared. To him, I was just a momentary distraction. I clearly had interest in this and had developed some modicum of skill, and he appreciated that, I suppose, and was willing to spend the time with us that day. But that was the end of it. A minute after we left, he would have been back at his bench, busy trying to catch up with whatever job he must have set aside to make time for us. Now, that wasn't the only time I visited that room. The same producer arranged to take me back there once again about 6 years later, just a couple of months before the end of my long 100 Poet series. So to kind of round things out then, and I had another chance to watch him carve for a few minutes. Unfortunately, the producer didn't give me any tapes of that session, I'm sorry. Now, you saw partway along a shot of the roll of tools that I had taken with me that day to show him. I don't have the roll anymore. I've graduated to a little cardboard box. And here they are, many of them are the same tools I had that day. Remember, with little knives and chisels of this type, the blade part inside, let's show this, it gets shorter as you sharpen it. So you pull it forward a little bit. Now at some point it gets too short to fit inside and you can't do that anymore, so out goes the blade and you replace it with a new one, keeping the same handle. I've done this, of course, many times over the years. The blades have been changed many times, but the handles basically just keep going. Now, in the Remembering a Carver video, I talked about the tools of his that I was given by his widow after he passed away. And when you compare mine and his side by side, you can really see such a difference. Look at some of these here. It isn't just the super delicacy that I discussed back in that video, how fine and thin his blade was sharpened. It's the whole feeling and mood of the tools themselves. Now remember, Ito-san was a carver from a very young age. He started, I think, in his teens, and he was only a carver. These tools were used literally day after day after day for something like 70 years. There is an incredible amount of warmth, is maybe a suitable word. They have just been used so much. Mine, they just kind of seem childish in comparison. I started doing this when I was 29, and I'm 68 now, nearly 40 years at this game. And of course, I'm not just a carver. I do all this other stuff. And these days, I only get a few hours a week at this bench. So realistically, I will have to understand that my own tools will never come to look like this. But that's okay. I have nothing to be ashamed of. Although I very much doubt that one day somebody will be making a YouTube video about remembering this carver. And he will show this little cardboard box he found on eBay one day. Anyway, enough of this. It has been very, very interesting for me making this particular video, a time travel as it was. And I'm glad to be able to put this information out there into the world, where I really, really hope it might be useful for another generation of crazy people who are trying this. Thank you very much for watching this, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye for now.